So it could be 2, could be 3, could even be 4, all depending on inflation and where we head on that particular front. Well, that's one of the variables, at least.
Yes, good morning, Anna. It's so nice to start there with you. The Fed has mastered the art of the dovish tightening cycle. The Fed's very glacial strategy of tightening until this year ensured that 2 criteria are in place. First, that US inflation normalization is underway, and second, that this proves sustainable through diminishing spare capacity in the labor market. As a result of that, the real interest rates in the US, both the real Fed fund rate when inflation is taken into account and long-term real interest rates, have actually been remarkably steady for the last 2 years. And so right now, with inflation rising and with spare capacity in the labor market all but diminished, I think the Fed, as we've heard from Chair Yellen, is probably more confident with reaching for neutrality. What Evans's comments, however, quite interesting about is to suggest that the pace at which the Fed goes there probably could be more gradual.
Well, he seemed to question the veracity of the strength of inflation. If you look at personal consumption expenditure, when you strip out and you look at the core, that's 1.7%. And he seemed less than... I mean, I was listening to it and I read what he said. He just seems that little bit less than convinced. I don't know how he got to 4 rate hikes in his rhetoric, but he seems less than convinced. Are you convinced on the inflationary spiral?
Well, I can understand, given how slow to come this uptrend in core inflation has been, despite the strength of the recovery and indeed the remarkable resilience of non-farm payrolls in recent years, that the Fed should be somewhat agnostic when it comes to the inflation threat. Yet, one can see, even from your chart, Manus, how pronounced the uptrend is now. And also we have a uptrend that's happening in the context of rising wages, and also in the context of, when you look at like nominal retail sales or S&P earnings, but both of them are rising at 5-6% plus nominal GDP. Now, when you consider that against the fact that real Fed fund rates, so after inflation, are below -1%, the Fed's monetary stance seems extraordinarily accommodative for this point of the economic cycle.
Seems very accommodative, and then a lot depends on how quickly Donald Trump can pass his legislative agenda in terms of some of the more fiscally stimulative measures that he plans. Lena, what's your takeaway from what we saw over the weekend? We saw House Speaker Paul Ryan saying that the healthcare trouble does make the tax overhaul more difficult. So he's drawing a line between the two. Is your overall impression then that this just will take longer to be delivered, some of the tax changes that Trump had promised?
Yes, this is an important I think, point in how the markets are recalibrating political risk both in the US and globally, because what is becoming clear is that political risk is not a linear function. The healthcare bill could, in theory, free up political capital in Congress to focus on tax reform. In reality, however, this tax reform for a protectionist White House and a deficit-agnostic Republican caucus in Congress could, in fact, prove just as contentious.
I read your notes, and I've written down here, political arbitrage. I sort of read through it. It was rather early this morning and thinking, how do I trade political arbitrage, which is essentially what you're saying between Merkel and Trump? Is that a correct assumption?
This is a great way of summing it up, Manus, yes. I think the fact that we have had the remarkable juxtaposition between outperforming treasuries and underperforming bonds at a time when the Fed is in a tightening cycle and the ECB is still printing money. The ECB is still in the quantitative easing cycle, which will last at least until the end of this year, possibly beyond, tells us that there's something other than monetary dominance, that the Fed ECB trade that has dominated markets and market risk premium in recent years that's dictating the markets. The other thing, of course, is the political arbitrage.